welcome to our guests and our colleagues around the call. I think we should get right into it. I'd like to start by making an opening statement upon which we can proceed with the dialogue session to explore various concepts around the economy, the economics, the links to infrastructure, and the value that we need to bring to society at large. I know it's big topics said very quickly, but it's very important content therein that will influence how we work towards building our economy on the back of our recovery plan and the medium-term policy statement made last night. So I'd like to just start by making the statement. We are set to embark on another journey. That's on the back of the announcement last week of our economic reconstruction and recovery plan. Reconstruct, if I use that word, suggests that something was working. It's not working anymore, perhaps broken, and in need of a rebuild. Whilst recovery alludes to something sort of related to health or an illness that we need to overcome, and that could perhaps be likened to what COVID has done to our economy. So if we are optimistic, and I always want to stay optimistic as far as practically possible, and have a sense of hope that we are able to do all these great things that we talk about. And now we have an excellent opportunity to do so. When something is broken, there's an opportunity to fix. If it wasn't broken, then we may not have much work to do. So in that light, if we are optimistic again, and the reconstruction, we now have this opportunity to build a better structured economy. There are structural phenomena within our economy that prevents many things from happening as one would perhaps like it to happen. So now it's going to be with huge pain and huge effort that a rebuilding is required to happen. So even if one was pessimistic or even a realist, one might say it's impossible looking at the trends that have happened in the last decade or so, and perhaps even more so in the last year. And the trends I refer to are around poverty, education, healthcare, employment, the budget deficit that's growing, the tariff increases that we are experiencing in all forms that we are paying as households and as corporates, and then perhaps a decline in service delivery as well. But nevertheless, I think it's still required that we reflect and adopt a collective SA incorporated disposition on the issues at hand. You would have heard me mention the idea of an opportunity, which is the focus of this discussion. So I refer back to the opportunity, which in my mind refers to what we had stated far back when we designed the NDP, or the National Development Plan. And it was published some years ago in August 2012, around where we had many comments coming around it in early 2013, leaving about 17 years to make impact on various parts of our economy and the benefit to society. It makes mention of us electing a government for us all, for example. It makes mention, and that remains a goal for civil society until this very moment even. So the economic recovery plan can be regarded as a temporary destination, to quote from the NDP executive summary. It has to be that, else how do we move forward and onwards and upwards? So the economic recovery plan is premised heavily on the NDP, and it makes mention and reference to it. And if I quote again, it has many motivational comments, and if we have forgotten about them, it seems almost evergreen in its preparation. However, it cannot imply that we could sustain too many own goals whilst dreaming but not implementing. To that extent, the point of departure on the mention of the opportunity, I think I would like to make a comment that was mentioned in the plan, and that is what we do, how we do it, is as important as what we want to achieve. Let us explore these comments in light of the NDP, the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, as well as the statement made last night. As I bring it back to our engineering industry, our industry of civil engineers are deeply concerned that we are at an inflection point, and we sit with many choices at hand in our economy. For example, from the engineering perspective, we are unable to connect skilled individuals, including existing businesses and even new startups, with the work at hand. It resonates with the what we do phenomenon mentioned in the NDP. So I can confirm that it is exactly that. We want to do We are ready. We are waiting to rebuild our infrastructure, our society, and our nation for our future. How do we reconnect civil engineers with the work at hand? We have the demand for the skills. It's clear as day. We have the demand for employment, which is obvious. We even have some budget remaining. We have all of the technology that we are required to use to do this kind of work. And government is looking for funding to support the economic recovery plan. And to some extent it's funded and to some extent it's not. But we still need to deliver on these plans. So that's the end of my statement. I'd like to please humbly ask that I be allowed to address you in your first name, Miriam and Adrian. If I can please be allowed to do that, I'd appreciate that. So Adrian, I'd like to give you 2 minutes perhaps to give your opening statement to what I've said and perhaps integrate and weave in some of the concepts that I've mentioned together with what your experiences are as of late.
Thanks, Vishaal. Yeah. You've got me.
Yes.
Great. You know, Vishaal, I think you point to a number of important attributes that the frustration in the South African economic experience is that there is capacity and prospect that seems to keep getting snatched away from the reality or from delivery. And if I put on my macroeconomics hat, you know, as a point of departure, I can point out to you that through the course of the 1990s, if you cast your mind all the way back to the first policies that were put together, the ambition was to achieve 5% growth. And that sat innate in the structure of the economy. As we rolled from GEAR to ASGISA and then the NGP and NDP and now the ERRP, the policy ambition has generally remained elevated, sitting in the 5% territory. Although most recently in ERRP, that reference has been, or that benchmark has been moderated to start talking around 3% structural growth. Whether you anchor on the 3 or the 5 is not really material to my observation that over the course of the last 20 years, South Africa's delivery has steadily ratcheted lower, and with that have come increasingly deep social and economic ailments that take the shape of elevated unemployment, entrenched elevated unemployment, inequality with a Gini coefficient that sits amongst the highest in the world, rising levels of poverty and immiserization, and COVID really dealt a fierce body blow. What I would be careful not to do is to now attribute South Africa's circumstance to COVID. I think that we were already in deep structural murk coming into 2020, and that urgent, important structural remedy was needed. One of the attributes, you know, now to perhaps turn a little more brighter-eyed, as an economist, it's very easy to be depressing. But one of the attributes that I've been talking about for a very long time in my work is the prospect of gross domestic fixed investment to transition and transform the economy. By many measures, South Africa retains all of the attributes of apartheid. And you can start with urban geography, where Sandton and Alex are different countries. And that points to an immediate need then to re-engineer or re-architect the urban landscape, the built environment. Alongside that, South Africa sits with a range of infrastructural deficits, including transport, where we have very expensive and ineffective transport infrastructure, whether it's from pit to port or moving people around in their places of work. And I will finish with this. You gave me 2 minutes. If you think about your current commute, as we're doing this evening, we're actually commuting to the same meeting via data, yet South Africa sits with very expensive, unreliable data. And I wouldn't be surprised if sometime through this evening, one of us froze or was dropped from the call simply because of data constraints. So we've been through a period where we walked through an infrastructural deficit. We now sit in a new era, post-COVID, where we're born with another suite of infrastructure deficits. Neither the first one nor the second one have been seriously squared up to. And as you point out, we have the capacity and the resources to address these.
Thank you, Adrian. Can I please ask Miriam to give her opening statement? Thank you, Miriam.
There we go. I didn't realize I was muted. Thanks for having me, by the way. Nice event and great topic. Adrian's already said quite a few important things, and I'd like to bring it back up because I am speaking on behalf of the Commission this evening. The first thing is that, you know, I think one always has to remember that the NDP's top goal was one of the most important goals was achieving a 30% investment to GDP ratio, and about a third of that is meant to be delivered by the state, and of course a lot of that is infrastructure. Any developing country requires that. You know, it is just it's just part of the development process. It's for development. It's for the kind of transformative kinds of infrastructure Adrian just referred to. It's to underpin productivity. It's for supplier linkages, insofar as we still have suppliers left, and for growth more generally. And, you know, the NPC has done a lot of work on this recently. You know, the thing is that nobody would argue we don't want it. Everybody can agree that we need it. And the budgets have been there, but we've found underspending, cost overruns, shortfall in quality, and very limited impact actually on economic and social transformation, you know, as per the points that Adrian has made. So, you know, I think the main thing that we want to talk about today is, firstly, there is no doubt that infrastructure focus is the right one. We're all agreed we want to do it. The big question that we've been asking people who've been working with us is, what goes wrong? And so if I can just say, you know, the NPC, for people who aren't aware, has issued a number of studies recently, which is on our website, and I can provide that link if people don't have it, around infrastructure delivery, capacity in the state for procurement, capacity in the state to oversee the built environment, and to, within that, to procure, and the capacity of the key infrastructure SOEs, especially Eskom, PRASA, and Transnet, in terms of their performance, their governance, and market structure. So that point about, don't just talk about the list of stuff you want to see done. There's no doubt that that's important, but the capacity to deliver is the #1 question right now that we need to be talking about. Thanks.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you. I think if I'm not mistaken, we're sitting at 22% as of the statement last night. So probably 7% off the mark. Revenue to GDP.
I'm saying infrastructure spending to GDP is probably about 18%.
18, okay.
It's probably around 18.
Okay.
Somewhere around there.
And it's meaningfully or materially constrained or confined by the ability to fund it. So, you know, although I'm making reference to there's no shortage of resources, it is the case that South Africa's savings rate, and savings equals investment, if anyone's been tortured through Economics 1, saving is the origin of investment. And where South Africa's saving rate sits at 15% over the past 5 years, the way that you get from the 15 to the 18 is you've got another 3% being provided by foreign funding. In COVID, that 15 has fallen all the way down to 10. So if anything, it's put a serious near-term obstacle in the capacity of the economy, not the state, the capacity of the economy to deliver that very necessary gross domestic fixed investment.
Thank you. I'd like to take one step back, Miriam. You spoke about the plans that are absolutely necessary, all that we want. But just to take one step back, Adrian, I'd like to just ask this question. What are the building blocks of a recovery process? And I'd like to say there's mention of many projects. There's trillions of rands being bandied about. There's projects that have been enacted in the Infrastructure Act. Over time, development plans can become almost like teasers because they tease you that there's this element of hope and there's an element of development that's coming. But of these plans that I've mentioned, I assume that we would always need a developmental strategy to back the plan. In other words, it has to be part of a strategy that's sort of integrated, coherent, and sort of cascaded into like a sectoral focus on it. This sector needs development, that sector may not, this sector needs priority. And that's the comment I make. And what is your sense of the projects that are mentioned and the sectoral strategy that's related to these projects? What's your view on that in terms of how we would go about building and recovering within one or two sectors, if I might ask you that?
Vishaal, I think that's such a critical point. Miriam's already made the key observation that what I think the immediate prospect, the near-term prospect is built on is the foundation of capacity to turn the ideas into delivery, into action. The policy is good. The framework is robust. The thinking is very, very sound. Where we sit with this deficit is between that exceptional policy and planning and the eventual outcome. We can talk about a range of reasons why I think that that's missing in action. There's a lot of work that's been done to try and understand where those deficits sit. There's two things that your observational question make me think about more immediately. The first is that my observation would be that again and again our policy tries to eat the elephant in one bite, that it is very grand and if anything almost too ambitious, and because it's too ambitious we set ourselves up that we are going to fail. And that's I suppose a somewhat philosophical point. Could we be more modest and at the same time ambitious? Then we start to deliver some success and bolster belief. Related to that is the available free lunch for South Africa sits in the form of bolstered confidence. And bolstered confidence would quickly bring with it, because South Africa is a highly desired destination. We've got so many things that work in our favor, but we have to remember that capital, not just international capital, domestic capital has the option of where it allocates itself. And so I worry that we operate sometimes under a different assumption that capital is obliged or investors are obliged or that we are a go-to destination, almost like a no-brainer. We aren't. And that we are competing in an increasingly fierce market for capital allocation. And you can think of Ethiopia with a population of 100 million that's been growing at 9% per annum for the last 20 years. They're in the process of finishing Bole Airport, which will handle 100 million passengers per annum. 100 million passengers per annum. Ethiopia has built Heathrow. That's what's in the process of constructing. And my third point is that if we perhaps could be less, I don't want to sound like a killjoy. I'm trying to capture the right words in real time. But if we could be less ambitious, I think we might actually be more successful. And my rock star in trying to make this example is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the head of the Liberian state, when she was appointed, I'll make the numbers up, they're approximately right. When she was appointed, she says, over the next 180 days, we're going to deliver these 90 projects. And at the end of the 180 days, they went and measured the success rate, 85% success rate. And that generates early wins, quick wins. And with that then comes the flywheel starts to move. And when that flywheel starts to move in your favor and accumulate strength, that's when you get the spillovers and the multipliers. And then you are in the industry of transformative economic growth.
Thank you, Adrian. Miriam, in keeping with what Adrian is talking about, maybe we are biting off more than we can chew. But if I recall what was mentioned last night, there's a prediction of a 3.2% GDP in the next year, with probably a 1.5% for the next 2 years. That sounds reasonable, Adrian and Miriam. It might even be shooting too low, perhaps. I'm not, if you talk about, perhaps Ethiopia was moving off a lower base, I'm not sure. But isn't that low already? That's just a comment from my side. And what would be your response, Miriam?
Are you asking me about the 3 or Miriam? Sorry,
no, Miriam. Yeah, Miriam.
Apologies.
Look, the reason that we would be potentially reaching for 3 doesn't shoot the lights out ever. But the reason that you might be thinking about 3 is that you're still bouncing back from a decline. That's the only reason that this economy right now would be achieving a 3. And 3 is not great, but the potential growth rate of the economy is around 1%. So even 1.5% projection in the following year seems high, and has to be thinking that structural reforms would have started. For example, like the independent transmission operator, that we're starting to procure energy, that some of the big barriers have been shifted out. So those numbers aren't great. And it's not the issue of shooting low. I think if anything, they may be overestimating what it might be. But the point is that it is still within our power to ratchet that up. Those things aren't given from God, from the heavens. You create the conditions for growth. And this is why the NPC has been very focused on the building of capacity, because that's how you build on growth, is through public and private capacity. Now, the problem is that diminishing public sector capacity has had an impact on diminishing private sector capacity. And that is particularly true in the construction sector. And so to the point of what Vishaal, what both you and Adrian have been saying is the issue isn't to be reeling off the number of projects that we have, that we've got tens or hundreds of projects with this much value to them. The issue is to get focused on very few top priority projects, lots of projects that happen, but few that we're actually talking about that are mission critical, and making sure that the barriers to implementing them are attended to. There's a tendency in government to have concentrated power in very few people in the bureaucracy. And that is not good for delivery. What you need is a distributed capability. You know that if you ran a big company, you would know that. You've got to get the accountabilities right and have capability down to the ground to be able to deliver. And unfortunately, decision-making has ratcheted up to the center. So there's a lot of problem solving around the country from the center. What we need to do is strengthen municipal capability, the capability of the key institutions that, like the SOEs and municipalities as an example, that deliver infrastructure. That is the only way we're going to do this, which is why the NPC has been focused on that. And that will lead to a ratcheting up of that GDP ratio. That GDP ratio could be different. It's within our power to change it. It's not, like I say, it doesn't fall from the heavens. It's very much related to the capacity of various sectors to deliver and growing capacity, the capacity to learn and to improve.
Thank you, Miriam. Nthabeleng?
Yeah, so I'd like to come in at this point. So yesterday's budget statement reaffirmed allocation to priority projects that were outlined in the recovery plan. But we also know that the minister gave a stern warning, obviously, of the going or worsening economic conditions, and these include a slowing pace of growth. So with these and taking into account the growing socio-economic challenges that emanate from COVID-19, Miriam, how do we ensure that we sustain the interventions that were outlined in the recovery plan?
Well, the very thing that I was saying. To get off the infrastructure story, the revenue projections in the plan assume a certain capacity in revenue services. What I would have liked to have seen, and this is where civil society can get, we need more voice, is I think it's great that Treasury would like to see that kind of performance out of revenue services. You now have a very competent and honest and capable head of revenue services. Treasury needs to invest in revenue services and build its capacity. Its human capacity, its digital capacity, general capacity to collect. So I would have liked to have seen, and this is something that civil society should be weighing in on, I would have liked to have seen a statement to say, we are making assumptions about revenue collection. And what goes behind that is this investment we're going to be making and the performance requirements that have been put to the Commissioner of Revenue Services against that investment. So we're going to be getting a return on that investment in revenue services. I didn't see that, but that's the kind of thing that I think we've got to get more involved in. You know, I've been having different talks with business lately, and you know, the interesting thing is we've come to a point where we say, the state is over there and we don't want to comment on these things, but the state is us. We have to remember that whether you're physically paying tax or not, the state is meant to be in the service of the population. And it is the right of citizens to be weighing in on what they see. It doesn't mean you have to get involved in the day-to-day activities, but on the big ticket issues around where the state's delivering and how it's delivering, it is the right of civil society to be weighing in on that. So what we're trying to do in the National Planning Commission work is to give fuel that enables a sophisticated voice of commenting on where that capacity and how that capacity can be developed, because that is absolutely critical to making progress.
Thank you, Nthabeleng. Thank you, Miriam. You know, Adrian, I'd like to pose this question to you. We speak about structural reform. It's mentioned many times in many documents. It's mentioned over time, in fact. And sometimes, you know, to our members, you know, you being an economist, you may know better what that actually means. Is it possible for you to share what would these structural reforms be that is spoken about, and its ability to deliver perhaps any near-term value to our development program? I know it's a long answer, but yeah, I'll give you 4 minutes maximum.
That's, you know, that's more like a 10,000 word master's thesis.
I know.
Vishaal, you know, structural reform, my frustration is that, you know, this term is thrown around and many people have come to associate structural reform with some type of punishment, as if it's a punitive instrument, and that because you have been bad, now we're going to structurally reform you. You know, structural reform is, and I think that that's admittedly borrowed from some very bad emerging market experiences. But, you know, what structural reform really refers to, and the engineers and the architects, I think, will quickly appreciate this, is that when you have built something with poor design, you actually need to disassemble it and put it together better. And it's going to perhaps be painful and even expensive to disassemble it. But what you put back together will be substantially stronger, more robust, and have better capacity and capability. I mean, that's the theory of structural reform. Your question gives me a chance to talk about the practice or the application of structural reform. And rather than wax lyrical, let me give you a couple of very practical examples. Structural reform might include the release of spectrum, which will make data more reliable and cheaper in the South African economy. And as data becomes more abundant and cheaper, more widely available, that could give birth to a whole range of new industries. Video tourism might be an industry, thinking off the cuff. That would be an example of structural reform. South Africa has already done structural reform in a range of ways. And that happened in the early 1990s when both the private and public sectors structurally reformed. Under the apartheid regime, foreign exchange restrictions, the inability of South African companies to trade internationally, they were trapped at home, meant that more and more South African businesses conglomeratized and invested locally with cross holdings. And you got these massive industrial animals where South African breweries, as it was at the time, owned Edgar's and hotel groups and a shoe factory. And as the South African economy was opened up and allowed to engage again with the world, unbundling happened and those businesses transformed. And what came out the other side were far more efficient, competitive, productive, profitable businesses. That's structural reform. And structural reform has happened to telecom, where telecom, although it remains with a golden share under government control, is being run for all intents and purposes as a private sector entity. That's structural reform. So, structural reform can take a range of shapes and forms. It does not have to be focused or should not be focused on public sector. It is an economy-wide ailment. And the repair equally needs to be economy-wide. And when you take away this mythical term or mysterious term, structural reform, and you talk about the practical application, I think suddenly it becomes far less intimidating and far more desirable for many, if not all.
Thank you, Adrian. It brings me to another topic now that is slightly off the mark in the questions that I would like to ask you. But Miriam, Adrian sort of started to talk about perhaps a concept of innovation within structural reform, the different types of initiatives that come out. It takes a level of innovation. And it made me start to think about the sustainable goal number 9, which talks about innovation, industrialization, and infrastructure provision. And that came clearly through it's quite loudly spoken about in the recovery plan. What's your view on industrialization? We've spoken about this for many years, but we all know where industrialization really happened. And what's your view on having any protectionist ideas around trying to resuscitate industrialization in South Africa? I know it's controversial, but what's your view on how do we get industrialization going from a business point of view? Because that would create a lot of energy within the country. It would create a lot of potential opportunities to be innovative and start producing locally, perhaps even servicing regionally. Again, I suppose my altruistic mindset is playing itself out, but we are locked into a trade relationship that's currently perhaps discouraging industrialization, but our recovery plan says that we should focus on it. What would be your comment on that?
Holy cow. That's a big question.
I know
that's not even a 10,000 word master's thesis.
Yeah, it's about 20,000. Yeah, I think that.
Why can't you throw the structural reform question at me?
Yeah, that one is. I'll give you 2 minutes for that one.
Look, in short, since this was billed as an infrastructure workshop, let me talk about industrialization around infrastructure.
Yes.
And the opportunity there. I'm a big believer, I've long been a big believer in procurement. 20 years ago, I had teams working on procurement. In a country that is highly concentrated, it is a fantastic opportunity. And so what that means is on my website, and I can give a connection there. I've historically had a lot of work done to look at how resource industries could be procuring. In other words, South Africa industrialized off the back of inputs into the mining industry. That's a really good way of doing it because your demand is sure. Yes. If you make something new and you haven't sold it in the domestic market, it's very, who's going to buy it? Yeah. So, unless it's a multinational investing and it's an enclave, which we don't have much of. So resource industries are very important locations for backward linkages. It means inputs industries. Now, let's just look at infrastructure. Infrastructure has incredible multipliers down, ups inputs from cement to engineering services, as you know, all kinds of bits and bobs that go into build a building, a construction site, whatever. We used to have companies that were leading international civil construction companies. And if we were doing what Korea or France, countries like that were doing, we would be building our sales and then making sure that we were selling South African inputs behind that, which is what they do. Unfortunately, we don't have those companies anymore. And it would be a very good thing to build it up. So the point is, the industrialization thing needs to come off the back of areas of competitive advantage and areas like infrastructure where we really need to do it. We need to do it now. 30% GDP investment to GDP ratio, that's actually not a 2030 target. That's a target, it's not a cumulative target. That's the kind of target you need to do now to be getting to that growth trajectory. Alongside that, there's all kinds of inputs and capabilities that can get developed around that. That's a fantastic industrialization strategy. The potential for protectionism is much less than it was. If you're in the United States, you're sort of in a powerful position. But the reality is, and then they've destroyed the WTO. So let's see what happens. Maybe Ngozi will rebuild it if she gets in there. But the reality is that there are global rules, and little countries like South Africa sort of have to comply a little bit more than some of the more powerful players. That's how it works. So we need to identify areas like agriculture, like construction, like mining, where we build our industrialization strategy around the needs of those industries. That's where it will come out. That's where it will come.
No, thank you. I think that was exactly what the sectors mentioned in the plan. So I think it's aligned perfectly. Adrian, would you like to help Miriam? She's got about another 20,000 pages left.
Miriam makes an important point. It resonates with an observation I made earlier that infrastructure has very substantial, strong multipliers, spillovers, and linkages that when you build a dam, a harbor, a highway, not only does it reach backwards and spill forwards in terms of the inputs that it needs and the outputs that it produces, but that infrastructure sticks around for a very long time. So it's a gift that can keep giving to productivity and capacity. To lean a little harder on Miriam's example, if you go back to the mining industry in South Africa, the mining industry 100 years ago needed support structures as it went underground. And those support structures were timber columns. Now, timber columns had to be brought across on ships. And so South Africa established a plantation, a forest. The mining industry went backwards and established the forestry industry. And the forestry industry, once the miners started to replace the timber with reinforced steel, be careful with what material I use here, given my audience. I think that's what they used. So they no longer needed the timber. The timber, here's the word of 2020, the timber industry pivoted, and that timber started to turn into sawmill and eventually into pulp for paper and packaging. And so industrialization can actually come from unusual places, and it can land up in entirely unanticipated places if it's given the latitude to run through those powerful spillovers, multipliers, and linkages that Miriam references.
No, thank you. Miriam, maybe this is a slightly easier question
I'd
like to ask. I'd like perhaps you to explain maybe to our audience how this multiplier works. when government puts R1
Okay.
and there's a private sector multiplier opportunity, and as it applies to infrastructure and our recovery plan, if you can link it back possibly, how does that work? Because that would allow our industry, the engineering industry, to look at new ways of supporting developments on the other side, and not be totally reliant perhaps on government spend, for example, to seek how to expand the industry to provide services on the private side, for example. If you can perhaps elaborate. Thank you.
So Vishaal, I don't think that an answer on multipliers will help the industry to identify opportunity, just to say. But I'll answer your question and then weigh in on what you are asking. A multiplier, there's different kinds of multipliers, and I'm not going to go into the range of them because that's going to be a 30,000 word PhD, page PhD. There's different kinds of multipliers, but the idea, for people who aren't familiar with the idea, is to say every time, say, government spends to build a bridge, for argument's sake, how much was spent on cement? How much was spent on various products? Then what was spent to produce that cement? And then the workers need to buy lunches and all sorts of things. And then there's social services that may have to arise insofar as it's a long-term project. So there's multipliers around that. And around that, then those people need to eat. And there's fuel costs and all kinds of other stuff. Now, the multipliers are higher the more that you're procuring locally. And that's one of the reasons why the state has been making a very big deal about localization for some time. That's why. Now, in terms of opportunity, you see the challenge in a developing country, especially if we're talking about civil construction, is that the state really does lead, and especially in a developing country, but even in a developed country. You know, bridges and roads and ports and whatever, even if the private sector is delivering, generally speaking, it's the state that's paying for it through some kind of, you know, maybe they borrow money, maybe it's through PPPs, but it's the state that leads public infrastructure. And that's the main form of infrastructure. And the challenge we have, we were starting with numbers at the beginning. We may have achieved I won't put my neck on the block, but something like 18% investment to GDP. It may even be lower now, I don't know. But it was that towards the end of last year. Now, the problem that's arisen is that the private sector has overtaken public spending. Now, one might say, wow, that's great, but actually it's not great. And the reason for that is not because I don't like seeing private spending, but the state is meant to lead civil construction. The state is meant to be driving that and then crowding in more activity. You won't find the private sector driving that because of the kinds of returns, the challenge in amortizing it. There's a whole lot of reasons why the state is involved and why we have SOEs. You know, whether that's still true or not is another story, but there's a reason why they exist, because it's very hard for the private sector to do this on its own. The incentives just aren't right in terms of returns and risk. So the state needs to up its game to get the whole sector moving. Now that's as true in, say, house building and certain areas, particularly for lower income communities. And there's certain areas where the private sector leads. So getting state oversight in various domains and getting procurement systems aligned to what the rollout of infrastructure needs, and the capability around project preparation. I know one of the questions, I don't have answers, unfortunately, for the questions that are being posed. They're very good questions. I just don't have the answers on tap myself. You may have it, but one of the questions in the Q&A is how many projects are shovel ready? Well, not many. So that project preparation story, there's been a lot of effort to improve capacity. We need to understand what happens. There's been so much effort, actually. And if you look at the paper we've produced on the NPC, which I've given the link to it, it outlines all the processes to build capacity. That's the kind of thing we need to stay involved in, and that the industry can get involved in, because if the state doesn't have that capability, there's no way around that. We'll be chugging along at a low level. It's not that we're all going to die and there isn't going to be anything to do, but we're not going to be a robust, growing, dynamic, getting to 3 or 4 or 5% kind of economy. So we have to fix these things. In other words, the capacity of the state in relation to infrastructure. There's no way around it, in my view.
Well, thank you, Miriam.
Vishaal, could I add to that comment very quickly to Miriam's observation? A little while back, I was involved in a project for the Development Bank of Southern Africa, looking at infrastructure spend and what the catalysts were of gross domestic fixed investment in South Africa. And as Miriam points out, the temptation is to imagine that it's the private sector that does all of the lifting. And to the surprise of many, there is very little relationship between interest rates and investment spend, that low interest rates do not cause more investment spend. So you can throw your Economics 1 textbook out the window. That relationship doesn't hold. The second is that there is very little relationship between tax rates and investment spend. That although incentives might help, they're not the be-all and end-all. Tax incentives are not the be-all and end-all. And absolutely, as Miriam points out, the driver of gross domestic fixed investment in the private sector was public sector GDFI. That was the catalyst. And so we should really be looking to the public sector as that driver and catalyzer. And then you might quickly say, well, but there is no money. And it's important that we distinguish between the project initiator and the funding of that project. And here South Africa has deep, established, sophisticated capital markets that are flush with the ability to fund a project on a build and operate basis, with the private sector providing not only the capacity to build and operate, but also to fund.
Thank you, Adrian. We're doing well for time. So I've got one more question, which I think is the one that's perhaps the most difficult. And I don't think we've got the number of pages to count on how to answer it. But essentially it's around the recovery plan. And Adrian, you spoke about the Gini coefficient. We've had many plans over many years. We've even exceeded 5% GDP growth, if I'm not mistaken, in the 2000s. But inequality is stubbornly staying. Sort of an exclusive economy stubbornly staying the same. How do we go about thinking about addressing inequality and doing some damage to this Gini coefficient that we have, that's sort of sticking with us at what, 0.62, 0.63, somewhere around there? I think it's imperative of a recovery plan to actually address something like that. What are your thoughts? I think that will be the parting shot for this webinar. So I'd like to give you a few minutes, Adrian, and then Miriam a few minutes, and then we go into hand back to the program manager.
Vishaal, that's exactly what structural reform is about. So when we talk about structural adjustment or structural reform, that would be one of the things that the structural reform repairs or addresses, is South Africa's grossly skewed inequality. If you look at the work done by people like Richard Wilkinson, it shows that this inequality is not just something that it's a number that exists and translates into some people being much poorer than a small minority. There are all types of social illnesses and ailments that accompany inequality, including much higher rates of incarceration, much higher rates of violent crime. Psychological illnesses are far more pronounced in countries with higher inequality. So there's a whole suite of social ailments and illnesses that come along with economic inequality, and it is in our collective interest. I love the point that Miriam makes, that the state isn't some abstract thing out there. We are the state. This is our problem. This is our society. It's ours to fix. And if there were an effective structural reform program in South Africa, one part of it would have to be fixing the attribute of the South African growth structure, that when the South African economy grows, you have to take your mind back some time, but when the South African economy grows, it is almost inherently jobless. You used the technical term multiplier a little while back. I'll bring another technical term to the conversation. It's called elasticity. And elasticity of employment elasticity to growth says for each 1% that you get in economic growth, what percentage do you get in job creation? And the number for the South African economy over the last 20 years sits at about 0%. In other words, even if the economy were to double in size, it's a sweeping gesture, but even if the economy were to double in size, that would not make a material dent into South Africa's joblessness. What South Africa really needs then is not economic growth, but an entirely different shape, form, and flavor of economic growth. And that is the structural reform that is so desperately needed. And a critical component of that is this infrastructure spend, because the infrastructure has these spillovers, linkages, and multipliers. And just to be clear that I'm not playing to the audience, there are other very obvious sectors that you could go for where barriers to entry are low and multipliers and spillovers are high. Agriculture is another very good example, where with relatively small patches of land, you can actually move beyond subsistence agriculture, and then subsistence becomes surplus agriculture. The cash crops start to become credit crops. You then need logistics, cold storage, packaging, processing, and suddenly you're exporting processed foods to the world market. That's transformation. And it is those types of progresses and transitions that will solve South Africa's, or will square up to South Africa's inequality crisis.
Thank you, Adrian. I think the agriculture discussion was part of was mentioned quite strongly in the recovery plan, and I think together with structural reform, that might be the way to go as perhaps in the near term to get benefit out of that. I think we might just have to work out how climate change is going to affect our crops, but if we can get on top of that, then we are good to go. Miriam, last comment on that issue of Gini coefficient and inequality.
Yeah. So Adrian, you've just provoked me. We were on such a good wicket together.
You can't have two economists agreeing on everything.
You have just provoked me. Okay. Look, I don't agree with this. I hear it all the time. Growth does not create jobs. We shouldn't be worried about growth. I hear that so often. In the National Planning Commission, I'm involved in a lot of writing in the commission, including the plan itself. And when we started out, I sent around an email saying, how do we feel about the G word? I actually sent an email saying that, meaning the growth word. And a lot of people don't like it. And I think I've been writing in Maverick about it, actually, to think about the psychology of why we don't like it. And I think it's partly because we don't believe in it, and we don't believe that it'll be good for us. But the reality is, and I've done a lot of work on employment, so I just have to weigh in on this. And I've given another website, which is where work on anything to do with employment, including the mining inputs technology story, is at my website, miriamaltman.com. I'm about to relaunch it, but it's still accessible. And all the papers are there for free. You could just get them. Anything you wanted to know about employment creation is on that website. Now, I'm sorry, in my view, I need to correct this impression. Over about a 20 or 30 year period, over a 30-year period, South Africa has had a relationship where for every percentage growth that we have, employment grows by 0.6 is what it is. That's been a pretty, 0.6 to 0.7. Now, that is actually a very high elasticity. It's a very high employment response to growth. And the reason for that, so just as an example, if you were in Southeast Asia that has had a very positive employment experience, that ratio would be closer to about 0.3. It would be much lower, but they grow faster. So they create a lot of employment, but they grow faster. Now, the reason that we have a high ratio of employment creation to growth is because we have low productivity. We haven't had much productivity growth. So you have this problem, this dilemma that I've been writing about over the years, which is you need faster productivity in an economy like South Africa's to generate growth. But that in itself is job destroying on it if you're kind of staying the same. So when I was at HSRC years ago, and it's all on the website. And if people are interested, I can point people in the direction of where those papers are. But I ran a theme called labor using productivity improvements. How do you raise productivity and also get people employed? Now, a lot of the stuff we're looking at in the Planning Commission now around infrastructure, like if you want to have high value agriculture exports and you want to create jobs around an export strategy related to agriculture, your logistics have to be super hot. You know, like if you're far from market, then you've got to have really good logistics, super low cost connections, hyper efficient. That is not what we have. It takes us years to try to get the container terminals sorted out at Richards Bay or wherever. You know, the intermodal linkages that were meant to happen didn't happen, that are critical. The branch lines in the rural areas were shut down. Actually, when we looked at Transnet's performance targets, when we looked at Transnet, you know, we did this three case studies of Eskom Press on Transnet, they didn't even have targets around rural areas. So of course they shut them down. They weren't even being monitored for it. So, you know, so what we're arguing in the NPC is, you know, you need to start getting aligned to what your core development objectives are. You know, it's not rocket science, this stuff. We make it very highfalutin, but it's actually not rocket science. If you want to have agriculture selling, firstly, you need land tenure to be clear. When you reform it, you should be supporting and having seeds and finance and support and water. You should have good logistics to market, be it internal or external. I mean, it's not rocket science. You know, you should have seed banks. It's not rocket science. You know, we don't have to go around in circles trying to work out what we need to do. It's really clear, actually. What we've been trying to do in the NPC is to make that plain so that we're not just banging our head against a wall, but we're making really concrete suggestions around, because, you know, because the essence of this is capacity. Now, so we actually got a lot of employment when the economy was growing. We actually were achieving the target of seeking to have unemployment. We were ratcheting up to generating 400,000 or 500,000 jobs a year when the economy was growing for a period of 6 or 7 years. Unfortunately, over a period between 1960 and now, we've only had about 5 or 10 years of growth, not even 10 in total. So it's not surprising that people don't believe that growth will help them, but there's no doubt that it does. Having said that, we don't seem to have dislodged from our historical industrial path. So we say we want to do it, but we love mega projects. Not me, but it seems like the country, that we love mega projects and we love energy intensive projects. And now that we're in an energy crisis, we have to start looking at a new energy paradigm. And even the CEO of Eskom is talking like that. But the idea that Treasury then says, look, we've got to focus on agriculture, tourism, construction, IT-enabled services is music to my ears, because there's no doubt that DTI does look at that. But you would never look at our industrial policy and say that those are the top priorities, because if those were the top priorities, then Transnet would have implemented those intermodal linkages, and we would see container terminals, and we would not see stuff moving up towards Maputo. We would see airlift, and we would have seen these SEZs around in Ekurhuleni moving apace. You know, and so it goes. We would really see shoulder the wheel around the visa programs for tourism. You know, the e-visas would have happened years ago. Ethiopia, since we spoke about it, has a really great e-visa program. Ethiopia has a great program. Vietnam, at a fraction of our per capita income, has fantastic broadband and a fantastic online visa program. We can't seem to get it together because, you know what, it's not our top priority. So where I do agree with Adrian is that there's no doubt that we need a paradigm that says, let's not shoot the lights out. Let's look at the areas that solve our development problems, create jobs, deal with the poverty. And that means focusing on industries that, number one, create jobs or are foundational to creating jobs. Not every single activity creates jobs, but it should be foundational and supportive of creating jobs. It should have lots of linkages. It should be part of the future of where we need to go. You know, and then we're going to get somewhere. And then core to that is the capacity development. We have to remember that it's always about people. You know, and I'm trained as an economist, and I'll still say that it's all about the capacity of people in key locations to deliver, and about partnerships. That is actually the heart of it, and that's what we've got to focus on. We shouldn't make this, you know, market reform sound so highfalutin and, you know, technical, and what the hell does that mean anyway? It's about people capacity and partnerships.
Thank you, Miriam. We didn't speak enough about capacity. I think you made the point a few times that capacity is important. And I think from an engineering perspective, we still have that capacity to provide those services as required. I think our construction colleagues are probably in a worse state than the engineering guys are. But I think if the development starts to happen, it will start to make sense. I'm really happy you agreed with Adrian on one point. It started off tense, but I'm glad that we had a chance to talk. I always believed economists are great people because, you know, as engineers, we work in the very, you know, we work in the present. We look at the past and see how things have been built. But economists have this, you know, have the skill to look into the future a little bit. And then when it doesn't happen, they tell us why it didn't happen. So I think that's why I like this discussion. I really enjoyed it. And from my side, I'd like to say thank you. I hope you enjoyed it as well and sharing your ideas around this.